So it's my great privilege and pleasure to welcome you all to this first inaugural session of our Neurodivergent Infinity Network of Educators series. We've entitled Neurodivergent Changemakers, Challenging Norms and Cultivating Neuroaffirmative Change with Authentic Neurodivergent Community Leaders. I know it's a mouthful, but all important stuff, right? And as you will see, we have our 9 logo on the right-hand side of the screen. For those who are not able to read or see, I do want to make sure that I honor everyone's ways of receiving information. The 9 logo is a rainbow infinity symbol. It's breaking through a red brick wall, creating space for a vine with 9 green leaves to emerge. And the text on it says Neurodivergent Infinity Network of Educators. And as I mentioned earlier when I opened the room, we do want to do a land acknowledgement here. It's very important in many parts of the world. 9 acknowledges that Indigenous nations around the world have longstanding relationships with the lands upon which our advocacy and community leadership occur. In recognizing the traditional, ancestral, unceded territories of these nations, we value that the struggle for Indigenous rights is deeply connected to all human rights work. When we recognize the systemic and social connections within our work, it is essential that we refuse to historicize these struggles, because doing so ignores the impact of colonial oppression which persists today. In our advocacy efforts, we are committed to disrupting and dismantling the systems of oppression that have dispossessed Indigenous peoples of their lands and denied their rights to self-determination. This work is essential to human rights work across the world. So this is something that we wanted to share with you. This is what we call our heart work. Definitely hard work, but also from the heart, because this is about human rights. It's about identity, authenticity, etc. So when we do this heart work together in community, we ask that you and we commit to being present in the learning. So find your focus and honor your comfort as needed. You may find that you need to take breaks if and when your body tells you so. Do that. And mind too, right? In the email we referred to ensuring a psychologically safe space today and all days. Be mindful that everyone has different experiences. Honor and value diverse forms of communication. Be open to new ideas. Be okay with discomfort, but also give yourself grace. I say that one because in many of our mixed spaces, there are many folks who are autistic and otherwise neurodivergent, but there are also folks who are not autistic or otherwise neurodivergent or don't know that they are. And you know, sometimes people feel very responsible for things that have happened in the past when they didn't know what they learned during our sessions. And so do give yourself grace. Engage how you can at this moment in time. Stim freely. Everybody stims. And for many of us, it's essential. We want to normalize stimming. So make sure, you know, if you are somebody who stims, have your whatever things that you like to stim with. And for those that are not aware of what stimming is, whether you're here live or watching later in the recording, it's really, you know, could be something we think or something that we do with our hands or body, could be movements, could be gestures, could be holding an object, feeling an object. There's so many things. We should do another session on stimming. Everybody does that, but for many of us, this is an essential aspect of our humanity, and too many of us have grown up in places and spaces where we haven't felt safe to do that. So we try to normalize that in our schools and in our communities. And an affinity space will also be available if needed. So if somebody's not understanding that term, an affinity space, essentially, you know, when we have any opportunities like this, if there's something that perhaps is triggering or upsetting to you, particularly if you are a member of a group that has been marginalized in some way. So in these spaces, sometimes, things that are said or shared, it may not even be about what's being shared or shown or said. It could just, spark something that it's a trauma response. So we want to honor that. You may find you're able to just step away if you need to, but we also have an affinity space should anyone need it. So just do a direct message to one of the folks, and the folks that I think I haven't introduced yet in our recorded part here. So Sidra is one who's going to take questions in the direct messages if you have any for her. We also have Melissa here, and we also have Catherine here. So those three folks, as well as myself, can open up affinity space for you, join you in there if that is something that would be helpful for you, just to even process or just take a pause. But again, nothing is not required. So moving to our next, there we go. I do want to take a moment to introduce Anne. I guess I should have said who I am. I'm Karen Tim. I'm the founder of the Neurodivergent Affinity Network of Educators, and just so pleased to have you all here. We had a great response, whether people are here in the record or in the recording, just a great response to this. And that speaks to the commitment that you all have to being co-learners with us on this journey. So excited to launch our first, launch the series, but our first session and introduce you to Anne. Anne Borden King is a trauma-based journalist and autistic advocate. Her writing has appeared in the New York Times, Healthy Debate, and the Thinking Person's Guide to Autism. She's also host of the podcast Noncompliant, right? Many of us have heard of and experienced and enjoyed listening to Anne and Noncompliant. And that podcast, of course, is about neurodiversity, all things neurodiversity. She's also a co-founder of Autistics for Autistics and director of the Autistic Health Access Project. So excited to welcome Anne. Oh, and I should again say, image description. This is a picture of Anne that you would have hopefully seen in the poster. So it's a close-up of her wearing a brown blazer and a pink floral scarf. I'm just going to pause for a sec while I stop my screen share. Okay, and thank you, Sidra, for those. So just a reminder about captions and accessibility things before we hand it over to Anne. As Sidra's noted in the chat, if you click the button on the end where it says captions, you can actually activate those or deactivate them if you don't want them on. Some people find them distracting, some people find them very helpful. You're messaging Sidra directly if you have any questions that we would like shared later on. And to honor the presentation and to limit distractions, shall we say, for at least this first section, we just ask that, if there's anything urgent you need, like if you need help with something, message us directly. Again, that being myself or Sidra or Catherine or Melissa, who's showing up as M on my screen. So message one of us directly, and then we'll open up later on after Anne's concluded with her presentation part. So without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to you, Anne. Such an honor to have you here. Thank you so much. And I'll be quiet now.
Thank you. I'm very honored to be here as well and really appreciate the invitation. Can everyone hear me okay? If there's any issue, put a message in the chat box. It's nice to see everybody, and thank you for also attending. Advocates, activists, A4A friends, teachers, parents, caregivers, providers, thank you all for being here. I'll speak for about 15 or 20 minutes about the book and also about, I think the process of writing the book was really a lot like a process that we all go through when we try to talk about A4A and present our ideas about A4A to people with different views. So I'll talk a little bit about the process as well as the book itself, and then open things up for discussion. So, just hold your questions. You can just put them right in the chat at the end, or you can raise your hand for questions and it'll be moderated. I'm going to share my slides about the book. So let me do that. Here they are. All right. And everyone can see them okay. Is there any issue for anyone? Okay, so we'll
They're
get started.
showing. And do you want them in presentation mode or are you like
Oh, I guess I could do that. How do I do that again? I forgot.
it's what is it, PowerPoint? What is it?
The PowerPoint, yeah.
Um, it's
I
hard
can't
for me.
remember.
So click on slideshow
Yeah, there.
next to
Just trying to
record
see.
at the top.
Oh, I don't see slideshow next to
So
record.
home, insert, draw, design, transitions, animations, then
Oh,
slideshow.
slideshow, got it. Okay, and then I do
Play from start.
play
First,
from start. Okay, and
Yeah,
then it'll take the full screen. Oh, wow. Okay, that's great.
yes. Does that work?
How do
You
I
okay?
switch slides?
It should be an
I'm Anne. Welcome to my author talk. I'm Anne Borden King, and I'm presenting, and then we're going to have discussion about my book, ABA, The Troubled History of Today's Most Popular Autism Therapy. This is the outline of my talk. We're going to talk about the book. I'm going to talk about the book and also how we talk about ABA, because obviously that came a lot up for me when I was trying to write the book. And then I have some questions for you, and you'll have some questions for me, and we can have a discussion. Probably my book talk will be about 20 minutes, and then we can do discussion. This is a little bit about me. My bio was already read, so you can just kind of read it on the screen. But basically, I'm a journalist and I'm also an advocate. And I obviously am an autistic advocate. I was the co-founder of Autistics for Autistics Canada, and we do a lot of advocacy to policymakers. We also do community education, and we also do community building and support for one another. I'm also a co-founder of the Autistic Health Access Project, and we go into medical schools and clinics and help health providers be able to provide accessible care, more accessible care to autistic patients, including patients that use AAC. And Darla Burrow is my co-presenter on that. And I'm also the host of Noncompliant, which is a podcast about neurodiversity. And that's me. Actually, this is a picture of me at a counter protest against the Autism Speaks walk. And I got this really great t-shirt online, which I love. So, what can we learn from the dead leaf butterfly? This is from the intro to my book, and it's kind of how I open my book and also how we might want to open our discussion later. The dead leaf butterfly is a butterfly found throughout tropical Asia. You can see from the picture, it's a picture of a butterfly. The outside of the wings are brown and the inside of the wings are blue. Of course, when it closes its wings, it camouflages itself to look like everything else, and that helps keep predators away. But of course, when it opens its wings, it has these beautiful, beautiful wings with yellow and black tips dotted with white spots, and those spots are known as oculi. I think as humans, we camouflage too. And sometimes we camouflage by choice, but sometimes we camouflage for survival. And this is where ABA and the legacy of ABA come in. This is why I wrote the book. I'm an autistic advocate, as I mentioned, and I saw the harm that ABA was doing. We heard from many people in our organization about the harm of ABA and the fact that ABA is often required under our public insurance mandates in Canada. And we could see how that was harming children, and we could see how it was harming people as they grew up from being children. I'm also a parent, and my son happens to also be autistic, and I struggled to find any insurance-funded or reasonable alternatives to ABA. And this was an incredibly frustrating thing that just enraged me. Most critiques of ABA were very academic when I was trying to find critiques of ABA, very didactic. Sometimes they had postmodern language, and they were in academic journals, or sometimes they were in blogs, and it would be a really wonderful information dump that I loved, but that I didn't have it in the kind of a form that I could share with the people that I needed to share a critique of ABA, people in my family, health providers, school. I wanted something that I could just kind of summarized everything about ABA, its history, its legacy, why it's problematic in a way that people could read like a book. So, and reader friendly, a balanced history of ABA that also brings up the evolution of better ways than ABA. I didn't want it to just be an incredibly just the grim story of ABA without also balancing it with the incredible work that the neurodiversity movement is doing and that neuroaffirmative providers are doing to provide alternatives. So these were all kind of the goals of writing the book. I had to think about the tone and the message of the book because I wanted to reach a lot of different audiences. I didn't want parents to be turned away from it. I didn't want providers to be turned away from it. I didn't want people to be bored. And I wanted to stay true to my understanding and beliefs about ABA. So I would say these things to myself as I was writing it. And these are actually very things I use very useful when I'm even talking to people about ABA. So I don't want to be polemic about it. So the book is not an argument. It's a history. Anyone who wants to try to argue with me, everything in there's a fact and it's history. So I'm not here for an argument. I also tried to use compassion as a tool and a way to gain insight. I tried to put myself in the shoes of a parent, why they would choose it. I try to put myself into the shoes of a young person who's going into a 2-year program to learn ABA because they want to help autistic people and they don't know anything about ABA. And all of a sudden they're stuck in this program. I tried to also, at the same time, while I was putting myself in other people's shoes, I stayed in my own shoes because I wanted to be uncompromising in my criticism. Lovaas's victims deserve to have their stories told, and if that makes some people uncomfortable, that's the way it is. I'm not a people pleaser. I'm not trying to be a people pleaser. And then once again, I wanted to be hopeful and always place hope within this book and this narrative because hope is what's gotten us to where we are now, which is we're making a lot of great changes and getting rid of the old ways in many places. So this is the organization of the book. I ask myself, whether I'm answering the basic questions that people have about ABA. When someone comes at you to ask you about ABA, they often say, well, what's the history? So I put a chapter about the history. Why is it so much? Why is it everywhere? Why is everyone using it if it's so bad? Why is it everywhere? Okay, so I put a chapter in about how it's been ingrained in our policies and how they market it. And that's why it's so ubiquitous. People often ask me how do autistic people feel about ABAs? So I put a chapter about that with a lot of data and information, not just how I feel about it, but how a lot of different people feel about it. And then people often ask me, well, prove it, prove that ABA is bad. So, okay, well, it's pretty easy to prove that the research in favor of ABA is really, if I could be colloquial, garbage and just bad research. It's extremely easy to show that there's bias and that it's very poorly done. So I made a chapter about that. And then, okay, well, what's happening now? What's the story of this evolution where we're starting to move away from ABA? I made a chapter about that. And then finally, of course, at the end, I talk about the tools and alternatives and the wonderful, wonderful organizations that exist now that offer a different approach than ABA. And we'll talk more about that in a minute. The history of ABA, as many of you know, so I'm sorry if I'm being redundant, it was popularized by Ole Ivor Lovaas beginning in the 1960s. It's based on B.F. Skinner's behaviors theory, and it's used in residential institutions and prisons a lot. It's based on token economies, so people might receive, or a child might receive a reinforcer, which would be like a gift or a piece of candy if they do things the way the therapist wants, and aversives, where they can be punished and harmed if they don't do what the therapist wants. ABA is known for its cruelty, particularly as it's connected to gay conversion therapy. And we'll talk in a minute about the work of George Reckers and Lovaas because they based their gay conversion therapy on ABA methods. My perspective in this book, and I think it's true, is that there was a myth. Lovaas promised parents that ABA would free their kids from the institutions that they were trapped in, because remember, this was in the post-war period. A lot of them were in institutions. He promised if you use ABA, you can get your kid out of the institution. The reality is, Lovaas simply borrowed the tools from residential institutions and used them in his clinic. So mentally, you're not out of the institution if you're still doing all the same stuff they did in the institutions. Why did ABA appeal to families at that time? So in the 60s, 70s, 80s, Lovaas was offering this alternative to ideas, not just an alternative to the institution, but an alternative to the idea that autism was caused by the parents and that it was the parents' thought. Lovaas said, oh, no, 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 it's not your fault. This was a huge relief to parents. And then he said, of course, his equally nonsensical, in my opinion, that autism is just a set of behaviors and that it can be changed when we change the behavior. Change the behavior, change the child was his belief, which doesn't hold. And all the rhetoric that he had about this served to justify his very cruel methods. And I don't want to, trigger people here in this conversation and bring up a lot of the really upsetting things that he did to his patients, but it was very sadistic. And you can read in the chapter about the history of ABA, or you can skip that chapter. You can read about what he did to kids and what they did to kids in the gay conversion program. And it was just horrific. The ABA industry at the same time was setting up its own journals, its own centers, its own programs, and its echo chamber amidst itself, which we'll talk about in a minute. So I think the takeaway from all of this is that ABA was the first alternative to the institution, but it was not the best alternative to the institution. And just because something is the first, and just because we've always done it that way, doesn't mean our schools and therapy centers should still be doing it that way. I'll talk for a moment about the gay conversion therapy, and because there was such a direct connection. In 1974, George Reckers, Richard Green, and Lovaas developed what's called the Feminine Boy Project. It was a form of gay conversion therapy that claimed to convert people from being gay through behaviorism. It used the same ABA tactics Lovaas used on autistic patients, and the program was very cruel. And my book outlines one victim who died from suicide, and that's just one, right? Whose family went public. Reckers and Lovaas bragged about the program in their research papers for decades, claiming that they could convert people using ABA methods. And eventually, Reckers, though his supporters turned on him because, surprise, surprise, he was found with a male sex worker in 2010 and really lost his brand. Now, of course, gay conversion therapy has been outlawed in many places because it's seen as such a terrible thing to do and obviously not based in science. But if it's based around ABA principles, it does beg the question, why is it still being used in all of our classrooms on children? All right, so let's talk for a minute about the research. You can see the big stack of papers. That's what they like to do. They like to just pile up those papers. And as if the volume of papers reflects in any way the quality of the research. And spoiler, it does not. ABA's research was their marketing tool. They just churned out paper after paper after paper because if you shove a paper under somebody's nose like a policymaker or an insurer or a school board and say, look at this paper, people don't always use their critical thinking skills. They just see a paper and they think that means that it works and that the research must be quality. But the research is not quality. It's nearly always fatally flawed by problematic methods and bias, and of course, typically being published in their own industry-run journals, usually almost never any kind of a double-blind study, no control group, just kind of one kid. And then they say, we did ABA, and 5 years later, they could tie their shoes. Well, okay. But if you didn't use ABA, they'd also be able to tie their shoes. So this was kind of the circle that ABA research always went in with, the kind of single case study of a student or a child of any way, and saying a couple years later, they were doing all these things. It's kind of hard to believe that anyone would buy that, but I don't think most people read the papers. They just saw that there was a paper, and then they rubber stamped it into our schools. They used this flawed data to sell themselves, and in the early 2000s, there was a particularly strong push where the ABA industry mobilized parents from Autism Speaks to actually lobby policymakers on a statewide level in the United States and in Canada to entrench ABA in the funded healthcare system. State by state, ABA industry and Autism Speaks representatives went and lobbied for requirements, mandates that insurers have to fund ABA in Canada and the US. Now, here's the problem. None of their competitors were doing this. None of their competitors, like speech pathologists or occupational therapists, they weren't able to have this lobbying juggernaut that the ABA industry had. So they gradually got defunded and defunded and defunded, while ABA became more and more funded and required that insurers fund it. That was a big cash grab for them. And it also normalized ABA a lot within our schools and therapeutic contexts. And the policymakers and the parents, they fell for the papers. I don't know what to tell you. It's really too bad. And there really wasn't that strong of a voice they just outshouted everyone in their marketing. Then the neurodiversity movement came along. The neurodiversity movement was a market disruptor, and I talk about this quite a bit in my book. From the 1980s onwards, we really were able to leverage autistic people really were able to leverage new media and whether it was message boards or social media to connect with each other and also to reach out to parents and providers and to raise awareness that we need to move away from ABA and get rid of ABA. That increased the visibility of autistic people as well as the whole movement to come up to defund ABA. From 2000 to the present, of course, autistic people made more of a place of ourselves in disability rights by joining with disability rights movements, creating our organizations like the Autistic Self-Advocacy Network. And we were able to start to break into education, policy-making settings, starting to get a seat at the table in decision-making. And when we got our seat at the table, our groups, universally, autistic groups said, we don't want ABA. There really aren't any autistic self-advocacy groups that are pro-ABA. And there are really not a lot of end users of ABA that are pro-ABA. Eventually, under a disability rights model, policymakers know that they have to actually listen to the end users of the service, the autistic people. And that's what's happening now. But it's still hard to make change. All right, so we've come to a point where we really have an understanding that neurodiversity is basically enlightenment. It's an enlightened way of looking at things. We're 50 years beyond the founding of Lovas's ABA, and we want, and parents want, and providers want, and we want inclusion, we want caring, we want disability rights. ABA represents the past. Residential institutions, abuse, exclusion of disabled people, segregated classrooms and workspace, and segregated group homes. That's what ABA represents. People don't want that. And it's not just autistic people. People that work in the sector, a lot of them don't want to use it, and parents don't want it for their kids. So we're at a point where there's a shift. I feel like society has really caught up with all of this, but policy has not, and schools have not. But we are evolving, and the most important thing is we have alternatives to show. For a long time, when we first started talking about ABA, everyone would always ask, well, what do we do instead? And then you would try to say things, would try to be inclusive and very general kind of statements about what you can do. But we didn't always have programs we could hold on to and say, try the CERTS program, go online and have a look at what the Alliance Against Seclusion and Restraint says. Alliance Against Seclusion and Restraint just this year has launched programs for special ed. So there are things that people can do now that are out there that they can enroll in. And it's not just so much of a vague protest against ABA. We really have concrete tools to give to people. So it's a very exciting time. Autistic advocates are now able to point to those alternatives, and we're able to align with non-ABA therapists so that we can say, yeah, what can you do instead? Here's 10 things you can do instead. It's very, very powerful to have that now. So what does all of this have to do with the butterfly? That is something that I would like to discuss with the group. I'll show the conclusion to my book here, and you can read it, or I'll read it as well. Throughout their lives, autistic people are told to tone down their color, passion, and energy. Too jumpy, too flappy, too quiet, too strange. Some may spend hours and years, much like the dead leaf butterfly, closed in the drab browns of conformity, camouflaging in hopes of getting a job, rent, love, family, a place to belong. I've been busy for months collecting citations and compiling proof of something that should, in a better world, be taken for granted: the rights of autistic people to be authentic and free, to be bright and flappy and beautiful, to fly. I'm going to open up for discussion in a moment about the book, about the ideas, about ABA. I wanted to share a couple of links before I do. And basically, there's a link to buy the ebook. It's booksbyanneking.com. You can also find updates on the book, and you can find that link at this easy to memorize website, anneborden.ca. And you can find information about the book there, as well as information about things that are upcoming and the Noncompliant podcast.